Oh, fair. Yeah, fair enough, dude. Technology is not trustworthy. Return to tradition. That is
Indeed.
that's what we always. That's the entire topic of this thing. So okay. So I'll sort of kick this off by saying like my my cousin and I have been discussing various topics in Indian politics and geopolitics and religion and Hinduism and all this stuff. And the big thing we come away with is like somebody should do a reimagining Hinduism podcast. And my cousin turns to me and goes, "Why don't you do it?" And I was like, haha, no, I have other things to do. I went and did those things. So now I have time to do this. So yeah, and I figured I could do that with somebody who is very much in my echo chamber, like my cousin, and we could just sort of have a mutual wank fest of like agreeing with each other over and over again. Or we could spice it up a little bit and actually, I pull in somebody who is ideologically, I think, kind of different from me. And so that's why I reached out to you, Sagar. And yeah, tell me a little bit about why you're doing this, why you're interested in this.
I'm hoping that you'll give me a job at some point in the future. And technically, if you think about it, we are cousins. We're both Brahmin. So by some definition of the word, I am a cousin.
But
Very,
bro,
very
like which Gotram are you from?
which
Like I actually I don't know my own, so I
which
can't tell you.
Rishi has contributed to our genetic lineage. I don't know.
Yeah.
No, I'm doing this because why not? It's fun. I think the topic is interesting. I think both of us are have read and think about the same things, maybe from different perspectives. So this should be fun. Why not?
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. I think that's a big thing. Like, so when we had our first conversation a couple of weeks ago, I just kind of like, I remember just being very energized that day. And I was like, man, like I haven't had this itch scratched in so long. Like I haven't had like this particular type of conversation with somebody else and felt kind of like I could go all out, like I could just kind of say whatever that I wanted to, even if it wasn't fully thought out or like very, I don't know, very polite. So that's I hope that we can continue that tradition of not being too polite. I think it'll be healthy.
Never polite.
Never polite. Okay. So I sent a couple of articles your way before this. Did you happen to have a chance to take a look at them?
I did actually. I did.
Tell me more.
They were quite surprising to me. I'd heard a couple of these names before. Like I would say I'm aware of the existence of German Indology, and I had heard some of the like right-wing accounts on Twitter use Evola, but
Mhm.
I'd never actually read him or know anything about him. It just there's a lot of people like to me like I thought when I first saw him on Twitter, I thought he was another Jordan Peterson. I was like, okay, roughly because it's the same groups of people who talk about both characters.
Mhm.
So, so that's what. But this was like very, very interesting. I found it super interesting. I found Savitri Devi in particular to be so interesting because, like,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
she's like this. You know, she's very much a character from today.
Mhm.
Like 100%, you could find somebody from Oberlin who could do what she's done, except for different sides or with different ideologies. But that
Yeah.
character, oh my god.
I'm gonna present the Wikipedia article of Savitri Devi because it's just, yeah, it's fascinating, right? The first thing I'm gonna point out is that she has a fantastic tagline over here for occupation, right? Um, uh, which is teacher, author, political activist, spy. It's like, who is this person, right? And there's also like there's some other adjectives all floating around over here, which is that she's a French-born Greek fascist Nazi sympathizer and spy who served the Axis powers by committing acts of espionage against allied forces. Okay, all right, in India. You're like, wait, what? Right?
One
So
does.
yeah, as one does, right? So I love reading about people who are sort of at this like weird like intersection of a bunch of different things in history, right? And I mean, like World War II is like, there's all these like especially on the internet, extremely online people. World War II is like such a fertile topic. People love talking about it, right? And so this feels like to me like, oh, here's like this World War II thing that somehow has to do a lot with India and Hinduism. And that's sort of what like drew me to it. And I think it's, yeah, I think this is definitely worth talking about further.
I agree. You know, the idea, what is interesting also about this, by the way, that profile is quite common even today. So activist, teacher, spy.
Mm,
In India, for example, you have the phenomenon called urban Naxals. I don't know if you've heard of them. So the modern Naxalite movement also has people, and often we have a university in India called JNU, which is accused, like many of its professors are accused to be part of such Naxal organizations. Funnily enough, India doesn't have the reputation like in the US. I guess some law schools might have right wing or conservative professors, but India has no like right wing professors apart from this guy called Anand Ranganathan. I don't know if you've seen him on Twitter, but he's quite an interesting guy. He's definitely non-left, as
in
is.
general, I find that like academia tends to veer left, right? I mean, like this is,
Yeah.
I've talked about this with my cousin as well, which is that he says only like Austria is the only country he's come across where faculty are like decidedly to the right of the population, right? And are decidedly to the right of like other faculty elsewhere. And he's in a business school. He's a business school professor, and even business school faculty, I think, are more left leaning than the average person. And I think that's fascinating, right? And I think there's definitely something to like something about like um, being in your head a lot and thinking that the world is about thoughts, and if we could all just kind of sit together and like engage in our thoughts, then we would all be fine. We would all stop having conflicts and stuff. I think that's a very like academic thing, and I grew up in that environment, right? Like that's my parents as well. So like that's a big part of how I view academics, and I think that's why many of them veer left, like my parents do too, right? So yeah.
I believe that. I also feel like no, it's a really interesting idea, right? Because there's this phase that went through where we decided that if we think about this hard enough, we can solve it, and that was only like boosted by actual figures who were very, very good at thinking, right? So Einstein, he didn't do any experimental stuff. He just sat in a chair and thought about things.
Mm-hmm,
And then you have like these uber like geniuses like Oppenheimer, right? And everybody involved in the Manhattan Project.
mm-hmm,
To they not only thought, and they brought together both, like Richard Feynman. How many experiments did he do, right?
mm-hmm,
But at the same time, these people were so good at thinking that they could sit and operationalize their world,
mm-hmm,
right? However, what we have seemed to learn is that thinking or the appearance of thinking is enough. So we
mm-hmm,
have, because we've started signaling, and signaling is a much stronger force. So in academia, apart from places that need experimental verification, which is very, very limited, everything else is about thinking or the appearance of thinking. I have thought about it. And the
mm-hmm,
same phenomena occurs even in private companies, like you worked in product. Like how many models have you seen of projections and business plans and like, oh, if we only do this cult movement, whether it's agile or whatever, it's the same thing. And you sit there and you go, okay, all of these are great ideas, but what are we going to actually do? And you get nothing, zero.
I used to love data as a religion.
Yeah.
Like like just be like, well, the data supports it, right? And it's like, yes, but what data? Right? And why are you bringing data into this particular question of whether this button should be moved here or there? Like they're not everything can be answered with data. Not
Yeah.
everything should be answered with data. And that's something that's like very uncomfortable for a bunch of software engineers sitting around making decisions, right? Um, and like that's basically like I think that was a big portion of what I saw, and I think that like there's a failure mode for everything, and I think the failure mode kind of looks like what you're mentioning, which is that people signaling the thing rather than doing the thing, or doing the thing because they think it'll result in better outcomes without actually like knowing whether it will, right? Um, and there's another thing I also want to mention is like the bunch of the figures that you talked about. Like, yeah, they were good at thinking. They were also good at operationalizing. They also existed during a time when people were kind of building stuff in the real world, for lack of a better phrasing, right? We were going and actually putting up real bridges. So I don't know if you know about this, but there's this in America, when you get a civil engineering degree or get like an actual engineering, not software. And I'm a software engineer, so I can say that it's like real engineering, right? You get a ring, which is, I think it's a steel ring in America, but in Canada, it's an iron ring, right? And it's an iron ring from a bridge that collapsed because the engineers didn't do a thorough enough job. So it's like a reminder that you have a sort of tie to your community. And for lack of a, and for in my like world, in my vocabulary, the word I would use for that thing is dharma, right? Like you, that ring is in some ways it is a sacred vow, right? It is, or not vow, it is what you are supposed to do. It is your charge to go look after bridges and stuff. And we sort of veered away from that world, or like that's become like antiquated, right? Even that form of like civil engineering and stuff is like, it's like a little bit, it's a bit cute when someone decides to go do that, because we're like, well, no, nowadays it's all about like making Twitter accounts and then pumping and dumping some new altcoin, right? Like that's what smart people do, like, what the fuck are you doing going and like building a dam, like, loser, yeah. So, yeah, sorry.
Damn coin.
Yeah.
No, yeah, I think like we, in terms of like real engineering, yeah, we don't have. We need more civil engineers, not less, especially with what I've heard of the state of American infrastructure and
Mm,
what infrastructure needs to be built throughout the world. And my real question is, where's China getting all these engineers from?
mm.
Like, do they have like a civil core somewhere of people they've recruited? Because their infrastructure, yeah, like I've heard all the criticisms, like, okay, go cities and all of that, sure. I mean, okay, let's assume that the worst interpretation of China is true. Let's assume that all of it is nonsense, fake. I mean, even building that takes a lot of competence, right? And like, I mean, where is that
Yeah,
competence? Like visible, demonstrable competence? I don't know.
yeah.
And everything in the world today seems to have disincentivized it, right? Like you have Miami coin, and people are talking about city coins, but where are the people who will increase the value of those coins,
So
right?
I don't know if you've ever been part of like, when I first came to America, being a part of a fundraiser was like a really weird thing, right? And this is something that like, this is a part of the Americanization of the world, which is that um, we have fundraisers and we think that fundraisers are going to solve everything, right? So you come to America and people are like, oh, this is an ALS fund, and I'm going to like, will you pledge like $1 for every mile that I walk or whatever, right? And it's this really roundabout set of like ways of saying, please give money to this cause. I'm going to do this thing that like generates a bunch of attention. Um, and it's all this indirect stuff instead of just being like, oh, I think I'm gonna go work on this. I think I'm just gonna go learn about this, and I'm gonna find out what I can do to help, like with my hands, right? Like just get in there and actually be interfacing with the problem, whether that's ALS or cancer or whatever else. Like the idea that learning more about the problem, getting deeper into it, and putting my body into the grinder of that machine that's trying to solve that problem, like that's somehow devalued. And like, but raising awareness about the problem and like doing this big recruiting pitch and like trying to pull more people into it, like that somehow is like a very, like, to me that typifies the modern American sentiment towards solving problems. And to me, a lot of these like Miami coin and these things are essentially just advanced versions of that, right? Which is like, let's just get the money in here, let's get the interest in here, and then things will happen. It's like, yeah, maybe, you know money has its limits. Like if you don't know who you are and if you don't know what you want, like this kind of ties back to your question about China. Where's China getting all these people who are like civil engineers, right? Dude, they grew up in rural fucking China. They knew that they needed bridges and other stuff. They felt it in their bodies that their lives need to be better, and civil engineering is going to do that, and shilling for altcoins is not, right? So they don't waste their time with that. So there are a bunch of people, like my dad used to be one of those people, right? Like he just grew up in rural India, and he's like, yeah, the best thing I can do for my people in my country is get really fucking good at engineering, right? So that I can go back and build stuff. And so I'm sure many people like this as well, right? The older generation, there's tons of people who are like that.
Yeah, man. The older generation is pretty great. Return.
Return.
Taleb also likes to talk about back in the day, if if you built a bridge and if the bridge fell, then you were executed or whatever,
Hmm.
like, or the bridge builders forced to build a house under the bridge. Like same thing, like skin in the game. That's what he keeps saying.
Hmm.
So, but yeah, it's like overall, there's this idea that it's so interesting to me, and this is really interesting. This is something that I think about now quite a lot as I'm grappling with the world. Is you know, the Indian examination system gets a lot of valid criticism, but one of the things you cannot escape is accountability,
Hmm.
right? At the end of the day, yeah, of course, there's many exams. It's a big country. You can cheat. Okay, sure. But at the end of the day, there's an exam paper. It's you and the questions on the exam paper. And it brings in this sort of, um, sometimes even maybe overweighting it, but accountability, right? That word
Hmm.
accountability is almost taboo sometimes,
Hmm.
including, funnily enough, in private companies, these bastions of capital. And in government, it doesn't exist at all. Like, it's not about whether one country or one government or one culture is better or worse. In fact, like, arguably, China is doing very well at it. It's executing a bunch of like corrupt officials or whatever. But
Hmm.
point being that, in the United States, I don't see it. In Europe, I don't see it. Like, who's and in India, it's like fact. It's like technically impossible. Like in India,
Hmm.
like 1% of the population pays income tax.
Hmm.
Like a question isn't even worth asking. The fact that India functions at all is a daily miracle to me. But but like, what excuse does like Finland have? It's 5 million people, right? But there is no accountability in terms of funding or
Hmm.
where the money goes, how money is spent, whether it was competently done, etc., etc., etc. Like
But
I had an
that's the
American.
thing. So
Yeah.
I don't know how technical you are, but if you ever go into a Linux desktop and you type in top, right, which is the thing that shows you which processes are running. Um, as soon as you start running top, the process that takes up the most energy is top, right? The
Right.
most CPU is top. Like you'll see it right at the top of top, which is like kind of the joke, and that's why it was named that, right? But I think that my general explanation for why accountability is not more common is that it's just expensive, right? It's expensive and it's unpopular. Nobody wants to be like the fun police, essentially, right? To show up and say, oh, you bought a sandwich and only had a 15-minute lunch with a client. So I think technically that doesn't count as a business lunch. Who wants to be that guy? Like the people who want to be that guy, if they start running the world, Jesus Christ, like we will all hate it so much, right? Um, so I think that it's like, yeah, the accountability or whatever accountability does, which is reduce waste in the system and corruption and graft in the system, like it's somehow being solved by other stuff, or it has not yet come up. Like like maybe a big part of institutional rot is getting to the point where you need to then institute accountability into the system, right? Like once you've already done that, it's like, yeah, the core good mission of this thing is dead. And now in order for you to keep it on track, you need like police basically to keep the thing on track. Like that's my general view of it. Like if you've ever like I'm sure you have like if you ever worked in an organization where it's just like three people, like it's just you and two other people and you're just working, like accountability works very differently. Like you just feel like, oh, I owe this to the other person. Like I want to help them do this. Like you don't do performance reviews. You don't do all this other stuff. You just sort of like do it because you want the other person to be able to do their work. Like it's a very tight loop without this like accountability necessarily. Or like maybe I'm misunderstanding how you say it, how you use that word.
No, I can see it. It's just the framing that I've used often. It's just output checking, right?
Mm-hmm.
There is an input, and you are doing all of this work because which is supplying the input, running the system to achieve a certain output, and nobody actually bothers to check whether that output was reached.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's America's wars or the investment into coronavirus epidemic, right? So like
Yeah.
even that, like forget finding the doctor who made the vaccine and saying, okay, why doesn't this work, right? Like, okay, nobody's being honest about, uh, nobody's honestly saying even what is actually happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
That kind of really sucks. Like, yeah, all the costs, sure, there are costs, etc. But like, and it's so difficult to filter signal from noise and in such large scale events. But like for example, when India manufactured vaccines, and I don't know if you heard it, but when it needed raw materials, Europe blocked it.
Hmm.
Like Europe just blocked giving India raw materials, and then after it, even the blockage went away, or India managed to find raw materials on its own, Europe and the US both blocked Indian vaccines, right?
Hmm.
Even though Indian vaccines were better, like
Hmm.
in whatever, according to certain parameters, right? You can argue about it, but they were
Hmm.
better and they were blocked. And nobody actually talked about the issue. So like if your output was like actually reducing corona, then you didn't achieve that.
Yeah.
Like all that was created was FUD, like fear,
Yeah.
uncertainty, doubt. That's all. Everybody achieved only that. Like
Yeah.
government leaders are saying, on one hand, you have Sweden, which is like, okay, we're just gonna let our old people die. On the other hand, like there are places in the U.S. I just saw a video from Oregon where, uh, like kids in public schools were kept on buckets. Have you seen that one?
No.
So you have that as official. So you're like, man, look, you can do that, but what are you trying to do? Did you actually manage to do that? Right? And
Yeah.
it's so funny. Like, and people do this as individuals to themselves. Like, I have friends who will say, "Oh man, like I want this," and I'm like, "Yeah, you can have it. You could have it. You just need to like pay this price of time, focus, attention, energy,
No.
and you can get it."
Yeah. Yeah. No.
Why don't I just get it though? It's kind of unfair that I have to work for it. And I'm like,
Yeah. Well, I mean, nearly everything, even if you don't have to work for things, there's always a cost to having things too. That's the other aspect of, yeah, that's a longer discussion. But I think like no, the part that I want to really get into is um like when you say why is there so much FUD being created, right? Um I oh man, I had a really good metaphor for this, but okay, I'll describe what I think is happening, which is that air conditioners. That's what it is. Okay. Um, I think when FUD is being created, what's happening is that people are trying to reduce the FUD in their own home, right? So they put in a little air conditioner. They're just trying to make it cooler in their own house. Now, the net result of air conditioners is more energy output, and that heat has to go somewhere. So that heat's getting pushed out onto the street. So you're walking by on the street past like 5 air conditioners at ground level, and it's warm, right? It's not comfortable. And so that's getting thrown at you, and you're like, why the hell is it? Why are these people heating up an already hot day, right? And it's because that's a move they're making to reduce the FUD in their own lives and in their own institutions, right? And this is, I think that there are some situations where this type of FUD just goes spiraling, right? And it just gets worse and worse and worse. And like, you can take air conditioners again as an example of like, the hotter it gets, the more we use air conditioners. The more we use air conditioners, the more we like do this peak in a power consumption. And you know what happens in America when you hit a peak of power consumption? There are these factories with essentially just jet engines, right? Which operate for somewhere between 4 hours and 8 hours a year, right? Just 4 hours, 8 hours a year. That's peak capacity. But basically, they get a call from the power company. They boot up the jet engine, right? They started the jet engine. They pour jet fuel into it, and they turn that into a generator, right? That is how the American power grid gets through peak capacity, right? Which is that you need like you can't just add more capacity to a coal plant. Like that's not possible. So if you want spike capacity, you need these jet fuel things, right? And burning jet fuel on a day like that is just like putting tons more carbon into the atmosphere, right? But I mean this is a metaphor I think for how I think FUD and like general discourse degeneration happens, right? Is like we all start our air conditioners, we make our little bit comfortable, and that causes a massive external cost, right?
I mean, the fix, of course, is damn coin. The dam device generates enough to mine the coin. That's why
Yeah.
the dam exists. No, but like, think about it, right? It's like what it's so funny because that actually happened. Like in the jet engine thing was very new to me. Like it's so crazy. It makes no sense because
Mm,
and it turns out that because last winter or earlier this year that it reached peak capacity and it wasn't able to handle the load because it got too cold in the south, like in the U.S.
mm.
Right? You remember that? Like in Texas, it snowed and
Yeah.
like so I had people and they were like, and just to watch that from outside and you're like, you're the richest, most powerful country in the world. How do you not have electricity? How do you
Hmm.
not have heat?
Hmm.
And these were not poor people suffering. These were
Yeah.
like people. Okay, these were the kinds of people who moved to Austin, if you know what I mean. Like there's a
Yeah.
certain
Yeah.
segment. So
So
they were suffering. It's really hard to watch because some of them are my friends, but I'm
Yeah.
just astounded. And my favorite part was, though, what is worth remarking on is, as an outsider, I look at them and I'm like, oh man, like you're really suffering. Like it seems like your system kind of sucks, and they will just pop out of the woodwork like to defend the system. It makes perfect sense. It cannot account for this. It's, it's great, and you're
Yeah,
like,
it's not the system that's wrong, bro. It's the weather. The
it's
weather fucked up this
the
time around.
weather's
You know,
wrong.
it's like it's not the system.
The weather's wrong.
So I'm in California right now. And I it's a little inconvenient to turn the camera around to look outside, but you'll have to take my word for it that it's not on fire, right?
Oh yeah.
But like so California does have a fire season, right? Which is just literally what it sounds like. There's a time when things are on fire, right? And you kind of just have to watch out for that. And like that too is that is within a few within an hour's drive of some of the world's wealthiest companies, right? Are also some of the world's most unmanageable forest fires, right? Um, and I mean, you can even take this on a smaller scale, um, which is like the city of Oakland, right? Oakland has like multiple decacorns at this point, right? So Marqeta is one of them. It's like $15 billion company, card issuing company, fantastically profitable, right? $15 billion company, and it also has just this part called West Oakland, which is just kind of abandoned. Like there's just a ton of like big empty streets, right? Like nice streets. They've done some renovation on it and stuff, but nobody's gonna go there. There's no retail there. There's nothing, right? Um, and it's just like completely perplexing to me that you can concentrate that much wealth, but still not even have that leak out locally, if that makes sense, right? And I think that like, yeah. So and I think when I look at that, what I see is that our world is getting even more in our heads. Like our world is not geographical. Many of us don't live in our geographical proximity. I mean, even right now, I'm talking to you, you're in Finland, right? Like we've actually never met in person, right? So when we meet, we will probably be surprised at how tall the other person is because we've never seen that, right? So so like, but the point is like we don't live in the geographical world anymore, and so we live in this like weird like social thoughtscape, right? And so all the money from that gets collected in like one area might then get redistributed somewhere else where people know each other, but because they don't know the people locally, right? um and okay, to me, if you want to solve this problem, like the answer is, and I'm saying this as an atheist and as like somebody who's like, I don't know, I think I would describe myself as kind of like kind of like a bi-curious atheist, like where I'm like, oh yeah, I'm an atheist, but like, yeah, I'll try Islam, I'll try this stuff. Yeah, why not? That seems interesting. Um, and the answer to me just seems to be faith, right? Like for so many years, for so many millennia, human beings have just gotten together and been like, go to the local temple, go to the local mosque, go to whatever. That's where you get your water. That's where you get sugar. That's where you get good, that's where you see the state of your community, your literal community around you, right? And that used to be the case. And then and now we don't have that anymore. And of course people want to return. Of course people want to be in the community that they're literally in right now, right? It's like the most natural human thing to do. um and I think I think that's where a lot of this comes from. um if if you kind of go back to Savitri Devi, the Nazi teacher, author, political activist, spy based out in India, um, the Nazis themselves also had a lot of ideas of return, right? They wanted to bring back this animal called the auroch, the AUROCH. You know about this?
I've read about it. Yeah.
Yeah, the aurochs were the wild ancestors of cattle, and they wanted to bring it back so that people could wrestle with them again, and like prove their manliness that way, right? And the thing is, like, we're gonna keep wanting to return. We won't be able to, right? It's really hard to resurrect the auroch, and it's really hard to do a bunch of these things. So like, what do we do now, right? um,
I mean, if they wanted to do that, they could have just gone to Tamil Nadu and done some Jallikattu, right?
yeah, That would have been a logistically difficult trip for them. But that's what Sagar Dubey tried to do, kind of, right?
In our own European way, she tried to do it. You
Yeah.
know, but oh man, the Germans, like, have you ever met a more misguided people? I mean, have you ever, like, they set out with such good intentions.
To be fair, they pretty much did accomplish what they wanted to, right? Like World War I, they were like, hey, how about all of Europe like under
Yeah,
Germany? And
yeah.
didn't work. And then World War II, they were like, how about like more than just Europe under Germany? Also didn't work out. And then now, like, who calls the shots in the EU? I'm pretty sure it's not England or France, you know?
No, it's Germany and France. Like those are the two
Yeah,
powers. Like
fair enough.
Germany's so
Yeah.
powerful, and people don't realize that in Finland till 2005 maybe it was quite the norm to send your kids, like, as prestigious as it is in India to send kids to English medium schools. There were German medium schools here, like in
Yeah.
Finland. So you go learn German. It was considered a high class language back in World War II. That's where their soldiers went to be trained against the Russians.
Yeah.
So it has a huge impact politically in many many ways.
I mean, my dude, like even today, there are studies that say that if you were an American businessman in the 90s and you learned German, you basically added 20% to your net worth, right?
Easily, I can
Yeah.
believe that. I can believe
So
that.
I mean that's the nature of that's the nature of being like I this comes back to geography for me. Like Germany is located centrally in Europe, right? If you look at the I think it's the Hundred Years' War. It's like the Swedish versus a bunch. My history's a little messed up there, but basically, it was all these different powers of Europe all battling within Germany, right? And what that tells you is even back in the 1600s, all these people had the logistics to supply armies at least somewhat. Like they didn't have professional armies yet back then, um, but at least somewhat to deploy troops in Germany. And that just tells you this is kind of a strategic location. There's a bunch of stuff that can be thrown here, right? So yeah, I think it's kind of an inevitability that a place like Germany end up um, would end up sort of in the center of Europe, just because it is. Like, yeah,
I mean, even the Romans knew they were special, right? The
yeah,
Germanic tribes when they met them.
yeah.
So there has been a tribe and there has been a group of people that has contributed to this culture, and they've always been formidable. They've been formidable since Roman times, at least, that we've
The
heard of.
Germanic tribe designation for the Romans, though, also included the Franks and the Vandals and a bunch of people who were
Yeah,
sort of smeared
I mean the
across.
general barbarians, right? Like
Yeah,
the
yeah,
general oeuvre of barbarians.
yeah,
But it's still quite identifiable from what I at least understand.
yeah.
Like the linkage is quite solid, although like modern Germany is quite different, and probably it's much more like Austria and those places that have those Germanic links. But who knows? It is a central location. It has everything. It has sea, mountains, right? It
Yeah.
has coastal access. It has land routes to all over Europe. Um, so yeah, Germany, and with a weird interest in, I'll tell you something even more interesting. Like for me, when you send the article about um, European interest in Indian history,
Hmm.
it's funny to me. Like, did you know that this famous Toyota system that comes from Japan actually comes from America? Right? It is the
Mm.
Japanese version of the American idea of the manufacturing line taken to Japan, turned into what it is today, and then given back to the world. So it's actually an American idea.
Yeah.
Similarly, this Indology stuff is actually a British idea, right?
Hmm.
Like the Brits, they were fascinated by this land. They came back. There were British-German relations, and somehow Indology kept going up and down in popularity. And it was also signaling, like back in the day, right? Like if you wanted to show you were smart or acquainted with a land far away, it was good for you to show your acquaintance with, oh, Sanskrit, it exists, and there are these land of snake charmers and temples that are 2,000 years old.
Mm.
It was considered great, and that's why they would go and steal stuff from there and what have you.
Yeah.
Uh, and
Uh,
before the Brits in the 16th century and stuff, the Islamic empires had the same thing.
yeah. Sorry, I just want to make a brief digression because you brought up things go from one place to another. Um, this is Delhi, I think, or Gurgaon. Um, and this is a place called Coco Ichibanya, which is a
Right.
Japanese curry restaurant,
Mm-hmm.
right? So Japanese curry looks like this. Um, it is basically this thing called curry and rice, right? And Do you know the story of Japanese curry rice?
No, I don't know the story.
Okay, so the story of Japanese curry rice is it started off in Tamil Nadu, which is where basically it was rice and I think a fish curry, but I'm not sure. And then the British came, and then the British officer stationed in Tamil Nadu at the time really liked that dish, but they started replacing the fish with beef, or they took a local variety that had beef in it, and then they started eating the beef curry with rice, and that was like officer and soldier food in South India at the time. These British were then assigned to Japan to go sort of open up Japan to the world, right? And they show up with curry rice, and the Japanese are like, we have to get big and strong like the British, and the way we're going to do it is by eating Western food like curry rice. And there was a demonstration with like a daimyo, like a lord in Japan, standing in front of a bunch of people and showing them how to make curry, like to take this like block of rendered fat and that had like spices and stuff in it, and then melting it down and mixing that with rice and eating it and being like, this is how we get strong, people. This is how we become globally relevant. That literally happened. Like this is like, it's such a wild thing to be like, Britain was the interface. British soldiers particularly were the interface between Tamil Nadu and Japan, right? And then now Japanese curry has made its way to Delhi. Like it's such a weird roundabout way for things to be.
No, and
I love it.
the thing is that most people forget often, if there is a criticism to be made of these return type people or traditional trads or whatever, is that they forget that they believe that globalization is a recent phenomenon.
Mm,
And there are certain aspects of it that involve supply chains, especially. That is true that they have been enabled by modern technologies like the shipping container and the flow of information. But in other senses, it has always been a globalized world, right? You've heard of this book called The Shape of Ancient Thought?
no, I haven't.
Right. So it basically, it's a book. The TLDR on the book is that it shows you clear parallels between Indian ways of looking at the world and Greek ways of looking at the world,
Mm,
circa 1000 BCE,
mm-hmm.
right? And that was enabled by ship trade, right? So more and more, like Samo Buria keeps talking about it, as history keeps getting longer behind us, we keep discovering, in Turkey they discovered Göbekli Tepe, and we have always interacted with each other, and it has been often not a theory of conflict. It doesn't need conflict,
Yeah,
right? It's just
yeah.
been trade for the most part and exploration, right? And the Brits were the last of it.
Mm-hmm.
The Brits were the last explorers in that sense. Like going back to the article about Indology and interest, like even most Indian scholars today, however they feel about British colonialism, till the time the Brits came and resurrected it, Sanskrit was effectively dead.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can say that there were regional parts in India where they try to keep it alive with publications and practice, but effectively Sanskrit, interest in Sanskrit literature, Sanskrit history had died, and it's the British who resurrected it. Like
Mm-hmm.
they were crazy people. Like there were your exploitative, greedy Churchill type terrible monsters,
Mm-hmm.
and there were other people who they used to quote unquote go native, right?
Yeah,
They would come to this land and be like, holy shit, this is great. I come from a shitty rainy island, and
yeah.
this is a whole new way of living, and this is what I want to do. I want to be this now, right? All the ideas they taught me in Britain are wrong. They don't make any sense, and they decided to become Indian effectively, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we don't talk about the role of the Brits themselves in ousting India or becoming it difficult for the Brits to rule over India effectively, right? And in parallel, like in many Indian king courts, there were European generals training the courts and their
Yeah, yeah.
armies, right? In
So
tactics,
do
in
you remember
warfare, and
where Osama bin Laden was captured? Where in Pakistan?
Abbottabad,
Yeah. Do
Abbott,
you know where that name comes from?
from some General Abbott in the British Army.
Yeah, or I think it's specifically from this guy named Abu Tabile, um,
Okay.
who was a terror. He was like an Italian mercenary, um, and he was no, no, sorry, I'm confusing two stories. You're right. It is from a guy named Abbott. It's Major Abbott, um, and he was deputy commissioner. But the guy I'm thinking of is Abu Tabela. Yeah, yeah. I'm gonna present this one because this is a freaking crazy one. There's sort of a similar story with a guy who went to Mongolia. But this guy joined he like you're saying, he joined the army of Ranjit Singh in 1827, right? And then he was made like administrator and all this stuff, and then eventually he became knighted, etc. But he's known essentially for his brutality in Khyber, right? And like he acts like a savage among savage men, instead of showing them that a Christian can wield the iron scepter without staining it by needless cruelty. Like, this is a Western observer coming to observe this guy and being like, this dude is awful, right? And yeah, like there were so like this is just one example, and like I didn't know about this guy until I went to university and I met somebody named Tess Avitabile, and she was and she said, oh, my like ancestor lived in Punjab for some time, and like has an article about how he's a totally fucked up dude. And I was like, no way, this is crazy. Like, nobody ever told me this stuff, right? And yeah, it's this kind of hidden chapter of history, of especially like 1800s Indian history, which is like, it's kind of overshadowed by the British Raj and the narrative constructed by the Congress government to be like, we freed you from this horrible thing. It was so bad, blah, blah, blah. And like, and yeah, it was agreed, but there were other things happening at the same time, right? And like we forget. At least I was never really taught that.
Yeah, I mean it's a whole. I mean, I was just reading in that Wikipedia of the guy, and I was reflecting on so many things.
Yeah.
Notice that they talk about how when the Brits came to avenge Elphinstone, they were assisted by Maharaj Ranjit Singh's government
Yeah.
through this
Yeah.
battle, right?
Yeah.
And like, but at the end of it, I love that line because it's the most European dream.
Mm-hmm.
After having secured his retirement in Europe, he went home. He's just like, all right, I caused chaos in this whole world, but I have this nice little villa in Italy in the Amalfi Coast, like,
Yeah.
like this incredible place, and I have a nice little cottage there. Like, yeah, I established a city of gallows and gibbets,
Mm-hmm.
which I wouldn't do in Italy, right?
Yeah.
Like, but here I was able to do it for whatever reason. I assisted the Brits. I have set a fortune for my family, and I'm going home, right?
Yep.
And I just look at that and I go, oh my god, like,
Where's the skin in the game? This guy had
but
no
like,
skin in the game, right?
but
Or
also, please note that this is literally how the European attitude towards the rest of the world was born.
yeah.
It is a place to go cause chaos, and you go back home to your beautiful little island and your little yard and pretend to be a person of humble aspiration.
Yep.
Right? You completely ignore your sins or whatever you might have done as whoever. And I'm not, Avitabile is one guy, but there were many like him.
I mean, you know the story of Yale, right? Yale University. I covered it in one of my previous things. So I went to Brown University, which also has a checkered history, but not with colonial stuff. It was basically founded by slave owners, right? And like the main university hall was built with slave labor, and all this stuff. And like we have records of it. Like there's no denying it, right? You can't be like, oh, this is PC police gun. Like, no, it's like, this is like they were very upfront about it. They were like, yep, this is the slave's name. Yep, he died under a bunch of bricks, and then we got another slave. Like that was just like how they did it, right? So, but Yale in particular, Elihu Yale was a trader in colonial India, specifically in Tamil Nadu, and he engaged in the slave trade, right? And he engaged in spice trade, and he engaged in various corrupt financial dealings of whatever kind. And yeah, and that was what he did. Right, that was a big thing that he did, and now it's just like Yale University. Like the cleansing of his name is almost permanent. Like just nobody cares about the other side. Nobody really pays attention to the other side of the story that much.
Yeah, I often tell whenever I'm talking to sometimes my fellow Indians get a bit over optimistic about the achievements of our elites and our rich people, and I'm like, do you know this guy called Andrew Carnegie? And do you know how he became rich? Well, at least what he did, there's a bunch of libraries, including one that I benefited from. There's a Carnegie Library everywhere in the US. They are well maintained, well stocked, well kept, and the service they have provided to the nation is incredible. Who is an equivalent apart from maybe Tata in India? And even Tata has not done something like that.
Yeah,
right?
I don't think they have. And I mean, logistically, it's an entirely different challenge. Like that's like the instinctive defense I go to, which is like, look, man, India is a challenging place to deploy shit, like like if you want to deploy something other than software, it's really freaking hard to deploy. Like it is amazing that Geo was able to pull off what they did, right?
But it seems like no. But now knowing that that defense is old, but I don't think you can use it anymore because all the delivery services that exist today, last mile and stuff, it's Indians who've done it. Like they're Indian managers. It's not like somebody's come and instituted systems and processes. We could
Yeah,
always
fair.
do it. It requires someone with vision and someone who wants to do it. Like you have to sit on a table and think and be like, no, you know what? I'm gonna like, and this is actually a very like American tech startup way of doing this, right? Like,
Yeah,
what does it take to 100x this,
yeah,
right? So I want to educate 10 people. Okay, well, how do I educate 10 million people? Like, what does that
yeah.
take? Right?
So
Who's doing that in India today? Nobody.
I think that like, well, I think people like Baiju's are trying to do it, but I don't believe in.
Oh no! Do you not know the controversy they're caught up in?
Dude, I know. Look, I am not a fan of for-profit education, right? Like I have like there are many things where like I'm like there are many things where I'm moderate left, some things where I'm like center, some things where people would consider me right. On for-profit education, I'm like fairly left, where I'm just like, yeah, I don't think there should be. I think like, yeah, I think educational institutions should either be run by like non-governmental organizations that don't make money, or by the government. And I don't think they should be run by the federal government. They should be run by local governments, right? Like there's all this stuff around it, but like I get it, right? I think the people who are thinking in the way that you describe in India believe that software is the solution, right? Believe that like this thought stuff, right? Which is what software is. Like it is thought stuff. It's not material. And and I think that that's where all the talent has gotten sucked up, right? Is like people who want to make a change think that the best way to do it is through software. That's not quite true. It's the fastest way to do it. And then once you do that change, I think it has really weird effects on society, right? Like it's just like this like I think software is sort of like playing Russian roulette with somebody else's pill cabinet, right? It's like something's gonna happen, right? But you don't know whether you're gonna shit yourself or get real high. Like it's unclear, right? But it is something is going to happen, and I think that's where a ton of the push is. But when it comes to like I want to get back to the point of, look, who in India has accomplished what Andrew Carnegie did in America with his wealth, right? And I think you're 100% on the money. Like my instinctive reaction would be like, India's logistically hard, like all those things. I think those are wrong defenses. Like I don't like them anymore. I used to defend things that way, but now I'm just sort of like, yeah, things are hard, but like we need to go solve them anyway, right? Like we have to make some progress. Um, and that's the type of thing where um, I do feel very much like South Asian elites have been largely a disappointment, myself
Yep.
included. Like I
Right.
just
No, we still have hope. I think we have hope. We just don't have the reach yet. We have hope. We have hope.
yeah, I think so. I think a big portion of it is like getting. I mean, I don't know how into the Web3 stuff you are, but like I'm fairly anti Web3,
Hmm.
and I'm like I want to get people building things that like affect their local community and like really help solve the problems right around them, right?
Right.
And I want people to understand things like supply chain and logistics and just working with that stuff in their local area. And my like I would love to use my reach to be like to reach like 10,000 engineers in India and just be like, guys, spend your time fixing problems for like the people around you locally and like figure that out, and you're going to make way better apps that way, like learning the human
Yeah.
factor rather than
Yeah.
getting deeper into
But I
um
gotta say that kind of it has the thing is that I know what you're trying to do and I think it's a noble goal, but we also have to avoid like the Swades effect. You remember Shah Rukh Khan's movie, right, where he comes and solves this water tank problem,
yeah.
and it's a great movie. I think everyone should watch the movie. As much as I hate Shah Rukh Khan,
Hmm.
uh, the but you know what happens is it's so interesting because like for instance the I don't know. See, India is so interesting because I think the problem that Shah Rukh Khan actually solved in Swades is something that the government should have solved.
Hmm.
Right, we have really fractal levels of government in India. People don't understand it. People might see BJP, but BJP doesn't rule at the local level,
No.
right? Nobody cares, right? So there are really local funds being deployed, local whatever, and they should have solved that. And the fact that they're not solving it to me is an accountability problem partially. There are no checks and balances.
Yeah.
So he came and solved it great. But on the other hand, something that, for example, that would be a great public-private partnership, maybe like the equivalent of the Manhattan Project, would be chip manufacturing in India.
Mhm.
You know, you're not going to replicate it. Manufacturing chips in 2020 was actually really hard. I studied it. I have an electronics degree, so I theoretically know how to create a chip, like a microprocessor, on top of a silicon wafer. But I could make one, and then somebody from the 1960s would be impressed with what I made,
Yeah.
right? They'd be
Yeah.
like, "Holy shit, you got like 8 MB on this baby," you know, like.
Yeah.
Uh, but 2021, and who has it? It's Taiwan. It's not like America has it. It's Taiwan
Yeah.
for some reason that has nailed this capacity. But you know, like I often think to myself, I was talking to a friend of mine, is what does it take to start a project that you know will take at minimum 10 to 15 years?
Mhm.
So back in the day, I'll tell you the closest equivalent to that is Jamshedpur, like Tata steel factories, where you basically established an entire town. Their only job was steel, and you could spend your entire life getting really good at steel making. So their own culture, and including Venkatesh Guru Rao, right, like VGR on Twitter.
Mhm.
That's his beginning. Like he has this fantastic blog post. I don't know if you've read it, but King Ruinous and the City of Darkness. Have you read that one?
No.
It's a very, very odd, quite personal, it almost looks like, post that I often go back to at least once a year now. And it's almost emotional, like for VGR. It's a very non-ribbon farm kind of post. But in that, he explores some of this, like what kind of a city it was, what kind of a culture it was. And a lot of the people who, you know, like the sons of a manager at a Tata Steel plant went on to do pretty incredible, amazing things with their lives, right?
Mhm.
Because they had this thorough, exactly what you said, very local. They brought in teachers, you know, they trained their kids very well in STEM, and with the eventual goal that they would become engineers in a Tata plant, but it didn't matter, you know, like
Mhm.
nobody was stopping them. They could go on and take over the world. So they had the kind of institutional support that most people in India lack.
Mhm.
So both are possible. Like what you want is possible. They have happened in India already at many levels. Like, you know, Super 30, the coaching institute that gets people into IITs in Bihar. I always ask myself, what does it take to scale Super 30? It hasn't scaled. You
Mhm.
can't scale it for some reason. It seems to be something special about that
So,
particular teacher, right?
so I fuck. I want to take a moment to just appreciate everything you're saying, because like I know you're talking about India, but I think like to me what you're talking about is also Hinduism. Like right now. Like what you're doing is talking about like um the very fuck no. The only way I can explain this is by getting even further distracted. So April, Delta wave, bunch of bad shit happens, especially in my extended family, right? And like I'm in Singapore with a bunch of friends who all mean really well, and we're all sitting around with our dicks in our hands, being like, "What can we do, guys? What can we do?" Right? And like and then we just and then we you know, we're like, maybe we need to make an app where we can show resources and we can do this and we can do that. And like if you look at Twitter, so many people came up with like vaccine appointment booking apps and like oxygen finding apps and these apps and those apps. You know what none of those things did? Provide oxygen, right? Like so that's thing number one about that. Thing number two is um, even within Singapore, right? Even within the like pretty small group of people that I knew, there were at least 7 different concerted efforts to buy, test, and then ship oxygen concentrators to India. And each of like every effort was like self-driven with like a little bit of little community behind it, and then it goes. So like there's just this like everywhere you look in India, there's like, oh, it's hard to scale this thing. And then there's just like groundswell, like there's so many groundswell things happening, right? And like that is the thing where a lot of people go and they see the groundswell in India and they're just like, yeah, there's people coming up with ideas, there's communities doing stuff, there's always something interesting, right? And like, and people get very optimistic about that, and I think that's fair, right? And then people look at like the whole like, wait, but how do we scale this? How does this work for every Indian? And then that's when they get despondent, right? And in that same thing, I like in the same principle, right, which is like a bunch of groundswell things, and then the difficulty of sort of combining all of them together. This is the same thing that Hinduism for I don't know if struggled with, but has been doing for a long time. If you even want to call Hinduism a united, you know, a dharma of any kind, like it's that people keep coming up with new schools of thought and new ways of being and new ways of seeing, right? And then it tries to enter this big brand, and it doesn't quite happen in the same way that it does for Islam and Christianity, right? And I think that this is, I don't know why this is. I don't know why. I don't know if this is just an Indian phenomenon, or whether I just don't know. Like I know that every religious movement has its own, like, new ideas come up, but the way and the rate at which it comes up in India seems to be like, yeah, it just seems to be a different level, and it seems to be a big reason why there hasn't been a unified idea of Hindu-ness, right? Except as defined by outsiders, right? This is my central thing. So I had to say that because it felt like you were describing this very fundamental piece of being Indian, which is like, yeah, let's just go do it, and then we'll like, let's just go fix it, and then let's do it, and like, oh, there are other people doing it too. Okay, cool, yeah, whatever. Moving on. It's just, it happens so much. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you've hit something really really deep and fundamental there, uh, because I think have you read the culture novels by Ian M. Banks?
No, oh man, it's been on my, like, you're the sixth person who has recommended to me like this year, so I really got to go read those.
I think this phenomenon, it's so interesting. So like, uh, India is the culture, right? Like the
Mm-hmm.
civilization described in the culture, it is what India is, like decentralized. India is decentralized by nature. Like it has never been centralized. And attempts to centralize it have really backfired.
Mm-hmm.
And they haven't. And it's so funny because even just like the culture, they don't backfire because a certain populace rebels.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like the Indian way of doing things is we're just not going to do it.
Yeah.
Okay, it's a good idea. Thank you. No.
Yeah. I mean, and I would, okay, on episode 2 I can attempt to defend that a little bit, but
Yeah,
please continue.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's fair. No, but I think your observation is clear. I often wonder though. So two aspects to it very clearly. What are the things in India that do work nationally, right? It's, for example, respect for the army at a cultural level. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if you saw the remains of the our chief of defense staff,
Mm-hmm.
General Rawat, who just died in a helicopter crash. And this man is from the mountains in the north of India. That's where
Mm-hmm.
he's from.
Mm-hmm.
He's the chief of defense staff, and like he crashed somewhere near Tamil Nadu, like or
Mm-hmm.
inside the border, and his the remains are being taken through the streets, and it's Tamilians, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's Tamilians who share nothing in common with this man, not food, not culture, not language.
Mm-hmm.
Is saying Veera Vanakkam, you
Mm-hmm.
know, like so like so that is one thing that is very national. Like you could
Mm-hmm.
go to like a separatist hub in Assam and you will find somebody who respects the Indian army, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing in terms of culture. And the second thing that works in terms of operational things is, for example, vaccination programs. India, for some reason, I don't know how they did it. Whoever those geniuses were that managed to successfully inoculate India against polio
Mm-hmm.
had laid the groundwork for why the corona vaccinations in India have been so remarkably successful.
Mm-hmm.
Like the you it's so difficult for me to explain to people. You are taking a country like India, 1.3 billion people, and you tell me that there's like a section of friggin' Finland you cannot vaccinate because whatever.
Yeah.
Whereas those, we are on the verge of fully vaccinating the country, double dose,
Yeah.
right? It's maybe a year away at most. We're talking about 1.3 billion people, all democratically done.
Yeah.
Nobody forced.
So
Nobody.
I mean, a big part of that is um I think the Indian cultural obsession with health, like to the point, like, again, speaking very much from my family, like we are all hypochondriacs, you know like I will sometimes brush a little bit too hard, and then I'll spit, and then there'll be a little bit of blood in my spit, and I'll be like, oh my fucking god, I have cancer, right? Like like but like I definitely, I don't know, I feel that. So what one is, yeah, so it's interesting you focused on those two things. I would agree with that. I think there are a lot more cultural stuff, like music, right? Like if I send anybody in North India Mandolin Srinivas, right? Like they'll be like, this dude's amazing, right? Is really good. Like you can, like music is a big thing. Um, I think like stories, right? Like I feel like stories that are, there's like a certain set of like stories that are told between strangers on like in a railway car, right? Where it's like, oh my God, is it this fucking story again? Like you're gonna pretend like it happened to you, but like, you know, there's a certain set of like things that like teenagers will like joke about and tell each other, and like many cultures have that, but there's a unique set of stories in India, right? And I think that also like you'll recognize those, and like this is something which I don't know if you've read 300 Ramayanas, but 300 Ramayanas also talks about this, right? It's just like, yeah, like there are variations of it, and sometimes these variations of the Ramayanas like acknowledge each other, right? In very very interesting ways, but the sort of structure of it remains all over. So like it's, to me it is very clear that there's something like there's the modern stuff, right? Like the army, like that's there, but there is definitely something underneath, which is like, I don't know, like a layer above geography, or maybe two layers above geography, created by humans a long time ago, spread and shared, and it resonated with enough people that it has remained, right? And it has like, and so that to me is like, to me, I think if you really thought about it, there's like 20 or 30 of those things, right? And I think many of them are emergent, and very few of them are, I think, the result of like a one person going and being like, I'm uniting all of these things. Like
Yeah.
it was it was always a groundswell.
I mean, the last time some guy did that, his name was Panini. He took
Yeah.
Sanskrit and he's like, enough of this shit. We're gonna standardize this language. It's terrible.
Yeah.
And no, but the question to
Well,
ask
the
is,
thing is, even
yeah,
Panini's grammar,
yeah,
that also was a descriptive grammar, right? He wasn't actually, he wasn't trying to be prescriptive with it. Like that was the earlier idea, is that he was saying this is how Sanskrit should be. He actually was just trying to describe how Sanskrit was in his observations, which is actually super interesting, because that makes him the world's first world's first recorded field linguist, right? And perhaps last, because most linguists just sit in their desks today, but like whatever. But yeah, like that's what it is. It is very interesting. Like um, there's been people who've tried to observe, and via observation try to unite this whole thing. I don't know if, well, yeah, I
I
feel
mean,
like,
another guy who attempted that was Swami Vivekananda. At least he was
yeah,
trying to articulate that, right, through his
yeah,
journeys through India. And then often you will see what I call diet Vivekanandas after him, right? Like Nehru attempts to do that, Gandhi
Tagore,
attempts to do that. Tagore, great
yeah,
example. And
Tagore and
Tagore
his wife, right? Yeah.
yeah, and they probably had the potential to come closest primarily because they're Bengali, right? And Bengalis are crazy. Like back in the day, they were the good Bengalis, right? Not like the Bengalis of today. So like, not like they weren't economists, right? If you see an economist who's a Bengali, just run. Like, do not go near them. They, it's not a good thing.
They're
But
urban Naxals.
yeah, what?
They're the urban Naxals. They're the ones
Partially.
who,
No,
yeah.
they. I mean, definitely, they're a pretty big contingent. But I'm just saying, like, even if they were the least harmful Bengali economist is like carries the largest reality distortion field you can imagine. Like, there's this guy called Kaushik Basu. You can see him on Twitter. He has like a bunch of prizes, right? And this man is crazy. Like, he's batshit insane. He comes from Kolkata, and a part of Kolkata where he celebrates how dilapidated and run down and completely disgusting it is. He romanticizes it while living in the US with a US passport in probably one of the highest median income neighborhoods in the country,
Mm.
right? That's Kaushik Basu, and he's just one of them. And there's many such types. But going back to the topic, the idea was, if India can do X, what does it take to do X in India? Just like we did polio vaccinations, just like we did corona vaccinations, just like we did whatever, right? What does it take to do that? And it seems to involve looking at the world in a different way. It's a perspective shift, which maybe, and it is worth articulating why it's not like, why can't we spread education like we spread a vaccination? Okay, let's articulate those models. They don't exist. Like, the failure of the Indian elite is not only in creating organizations and institutions, it is in the lack of funding for people who were genuine scholars who would take an attempt to, like, a lot of what I miss that I really admire and appreciate about the West is the West now has a recorded 500-year history of people being paid money to understand and articulate what the West is and what the West can and should be. You can argue that it was a good or a bad thing. You can argue whether it was wrong, but the equivalent for India doesn't exist You have
Hmm.
Swami Vivekananda on one hand, you have Nehru's letters to his daughter,
Hmm.
but they are so poor. They are
Hmm.
lacking. I mean, not Vivekananda. Vivekananda is actually quite rustic and from the ground, like if you
Hmm.
view his observations. But Nehru was like a classic elite. You read
Hmm.
the letters and yeah, okay, like it's like he's writing a Wikipedia article for American liberals, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It's not anything that's real. So
But
I
what's
wish.
interesting is it resonated back then, right?
Oh,
Like
yes,
that's
in a
so
huge way.
so the like to me, I mean, I think we could go off for a whole thing about Nehru because I yeah, we all have opinions about the man, right? But the like to me the weird thing is the bar was so low back then. Like that's what was like that's what passed, right? Um, and there are things within it where I mean you read like modern Indian literature now, right? Even in English language Indian literature now, right? It's way better than anything Nehru came up with, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
even you can take even somebody most like politically opposed to you, right? Say Arundhati Roy, right?
yeah.
And like I don't like if you tell me that like you don't like her writing style, all this stuff, whatever, but you cannot tell me that she hasn't experienced more, observed more, and articulated more and better than Nehru has, right? Like that.
No, and also,
The
by the way,
mhm.
uh, she can write. She
Yeah,
can write.
she's freaking incredible, right?
She's very
Like,
good. She's very
yeah,
good.
no, reading her writing is it's like you're not reading. Like for
Did you
me,
read the Did you read the pamphlet she wrote against nuclear something? Like she has
uh,
the nuclear pamphlet.
I've read a bunch of her articles. I don't know if I read that one. I tried reading her second book, and then I started sensing it wasn't as good as the first, so I just shut it off because I didn't.
Nobody beats it. Everyone has this one book in them,
Dude,
and God of
yeah,
Small Things was her book.
God of Small Things was amazing, right? Like
Yeah,
that. Yeah. Oh man. Oh, shivers think when I think about that book. Anyway,
it's a really
uh,
good book.
my dude, I gotta get going. I think we
We did
strayed
not
very far.
touch the topic at all.
That's great. Honestly, that's freaking great. Like I'm gonna, we can title this whatever we want. Like next time, I think we should just focus on why you hate Shah Rukh Khan next time, right? And then, and then something else will come out, and that'll be great too. Like so, let's just
Yeah,
record it and put it up.
we should put
Yeah,
this up. Saria and Sagar unedited.
yeah,
Part one.
yeah, exactly. No, I love it.
All right.
Um, but yeah, dude, we got it. I'll schedule another one with you in like 2 weeks, 3 weeks.
Yeah, sounds good. All right, let's
Cool.
see how this one turned out. Looking forward to hearing myself.
All
Bye.
right. Take care, Sagar. See you.